On today's episode,
as believers, what should we be doing? Obviously, first and foremost, look out for your own children. But, you see these things around you, you pray. It's pretty much your number one thing. Take it to the Lord. And do what you can to influence things. But whether it's speaking up, it's acting, it's posting, attending meetings, supporting the right causes against the wrong causes or whatever. But the thing that I think a lot of us really forget, and because it's actually a little bit more uncomfortable, is offering parents encouragement, offering them comfort and strength and help and guidance. Just like, I know what you're going through. I'm going to help you with that. How can I support you more in what you're doing here? Welcome to the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Our world today presents people with complicated issues of life and death, marriage and family, health and science. It can be a struggle to understand or deal with them. We're here to help by bringing good information and a fresh biblical perspective to these matters and more. Join us now for Life Challenges.
hi, and welcome back. I'm Krista Potratz, and I'm here today with Pastors Bob Fleischman and Jeff Samuelson. And today we're going to talk about the topic that pertains to families. Most parents will maybe say that they don't think anybody else should be telling them how to raise their kids. Maybe I might have said those words at one time too. But many parents will maybe also say that other people or the government have certain obligations to help their family out in certain ways. And then on the flip side of that, others will get upset at any suggestion or interference. And so we see a lot of that. There are many different sides to that. Talking specifically with us today, we really want to focus on what the Bible says and what God's word is for parents and for families. Maybe a place to start is, to whom has God given primary responsibility for children?
That is quite clearly to parents, and we could say most especially to fathers. And just let's bring some Bible into this. In Ephesians, Paul quotes the fourth commandment and get specific. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live a long life on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And he has a much shorter version in Colossians 3. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing in the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children so that they do not become discouraged. And even if we didn't have passages like those, it would be clear from Scripture that fathers and mothers are responsible for their children because they are gifts that God gives to parents, and we are to be good and responsible stewards of all that God entrusts to us. And that's going to be especially true of the human beings that are placed into our care, or with mothers placed into our wombs. And a Psalm verse reinforces that, Psalm 127. Indeed, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward from him. So children are something given to mothers and fathers to be cherished, but not just as a gift to say, oh, isn't that pretty, but to take care of, to do everything possible for. It's a great responsibility, but it's also great privilege.
Mm-hmm. There's a few presumptions with this, and that is that the parents are rightly calibrated. When Jeff cited the passage, bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. So if you've got a father who's into drunkenness and gives alcohol to his children and they develop it, that's not the instruction of the Lord. And I think that's oftentimes where the line starts getting blurred, is that when we sense that parents are not acting in the best interests of their children, which is consistent with the Word of God, that's where it gets difficult.
Has God made us responsible for other people?
Yes, in some specific ways. Obviously, as we just mentioned, we are responsible for our children. We are responsible for our parents as they age, and we're supposed to give them honor and assistance. And if we have authority over someone, God has made us responsible for that. That would be particularly true if we were in the government. God has given us that responsibility. But also if you're an employer, if you're a boss, a manager, or there are people in your household other than your children that you might be responsible for them. Romans 13 makes clear the responsibility of the ruler toward his people, and the same sections of Ephesians and Colossians that talked about parents and children also talk about those other relationships. We don't have primary responsibility for people in general, but love for our neighbor, and especially love for our relatives and for our fellow Christians, means that we take some responsibility because we're interested in their welfare, because we know that our actions or our inaction, our decisions, our words, all of those kinds of things have an effect on other people. And so there is responsibility there. It's hard not to think of Cain's feeble attempt to deflect responsibility when he answered God's question about where Abel was, whom he had just killed. Well, am I my brother's keeper? God never gave a direct answer to that, but there was an implication. Well, yeah, you do have a responsibility, at the very least, not to kill him. And we can say that we are responsible for protecting other people's lives and health, and that when we have that ability or opportunity, that's behind much of the motivations and arguments that the pro-lifers have and use. Particularly point to that passage in Proverbs 31. Speak up for those who cannot speak. Speak for the rights of all those who are defenseless. Speak up, judge fairly, and defend the oppressed and needy.
Over the years in my ministry, I've been brought in on interventions, which are really difficult, very uncomfortable experiences. And a few of them have been related to suspicions of some form of child abuse and so forth. And you cross that gray area in your relationship with people where it's not my child, but I have to step in. And I did a lot of thinking, like when you sent this out, Krista, that this is what we were going to talk about. Did a lot of thinking and praying about it. And the one of the things that I've concluded about it is that it reminded me a little bit about the old Supreme Court case about defining pornography, when the justice said, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. And the reality is that there are areas that are intuitively, clearly wrong. Like you may be a close protector of your right to raise your children, but if you and the family are over at our house and all of a sudden one of the kids go running out into traffic and I happen to be the close one there, I am going to usurp your authority immediately and rescue them, pull them back so they aren't being hurt. And I don't think most normal, sane people would disagree with that, because it is clear. But what I think happens where we get into trouble is when we look at the way you raise your children and we say to ourselves, well, that's not how I did it, or that's not how I raised you. You know, I mean, you get that. That's a problem when you're a grandparent. You know, you're always going, I don't know where they got that from. I sure didn't teach them that. But you get into that, but it becomes a lot of technique. In other words, we've abandoned the objective truths, like rescuing them rather than letting them get hit by a car. And we get into the technique approach, which is your style versus my style. And as a parish pastor, I'm sure, Jeff, you experience this, where there'd be like a consistently or persistently unruly kid in church. And at some point, it comes up at the council meeting, and the pastor, you need to do something about this. Now, wait a minute. I didn't cause it. But
it's not my kid.
Yeah. But I mean, I faced that, where they, all of a sudden they came to me and said, you got to do something about it, and this is where technique sometimes gets too far, and we'll say like my technique worked.
Yeah.
Okay. I happen to see in full honesty, I've seen other people use my parenting technique and have it not work. So there's a lot more at work here than just technique.
Yeah.
Yeah. As Lutherans, we have a special kind of advantage. We're programmed with the sense that we have a responsibility towards other people from the Small Catechism. particularly if we benefited from memorizing it and being taught it as children. Luther's explanations of the commandments in the Small Catechism, what's called the second table of the law, they underscore this idea that we have a responsibility to our neighbor, not just to do no harm to our neighbor, not just to sin against our neighbor, but with the seventh, what does it say? Help him to improve and protect his property and means of income. With the eighth commandment, defend him, speak well of him, and take his words and actions in the kindest possible way. Ninth, do all we can to help him keep his inheritance in house. And the 10th, to urge our neighbor's spouse, workers, or animals to stay and do their duty. We understand that just as there's a thou shalt not, there's also a and thou shalt, that's implicit in those commandments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking, about this question, like, has God made us responsible for other people's children? And I think like the key word is maybe like how people define responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Because like as Bob was saying, yes, somebody's kid going into traffic, okay, yeah, you're going to pull them out of traffic. Or if you notice that there is abuse going on at your neighbor's house, you might say something. I mean, you should say something to help that situation. But when we think, oh, we're just responsible because we don't like what that person is doing, or it isn't the way that we would do it, then I think those become more sticky situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When you study what the Pharisees had done with the law, it sprouted from a noble heart. I think the Pharisees were looking at things and said, well, we're supposed to remember the Sabbath. Okay, so and then they began to define, and it was like 746 regulations or something like that they had come up with, and that's a little bit like what happens when you're parenting, because everything becomes a theological matter when you are an uber Christian. You're an uber Christian, so you say to yourself, we're supposed to raise our children and the children in admonition of the Lord. So I look at what you're doing, and Krista, you're not teaching those children to sit still in church. They should sit still.
You try it, Bob.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it was always funny. I should tell you some stories about that. We've had when your children were born while you're like in the pulpit. When your poor wife your spouse has to deal with the disciplining and all that kind of stuff. But what's interesting about it is how people will. I had a chairman of my congregation who was a retired Christian day school principal. And the story used to be that he had developed the Medusa stare. That's what it was referred to in a church council meeting where they came up. And that is, some kid would be acting up in church, and he would turn around with that turn you to stone look that only a seasoned principal had. And that would stop the kid no matter whatever the parents did. My point is that part of it has to do with the demeanor that you have. There are people who could come to me and offer me suggestions for raising the kids that I would embrace. There just is something about their demeanor that we're on the same plane, we're trying to accomplish the same thing, so forth. There are other people who come and say the exact same thing, and I would never want to listen to it. And that's the problem when you're trying to tell other people how to do their business. Is that sometimes, quite honestly, there are other things in your life that never gave you that permission. I was reading in the Gospels how a prophet is not welcomed in his hometown. Now, Jesus applied this to himself. Now, can you imagine Jesus not being welcomed in your hometown? Why wouldn't he be welcomed in everything? Sometimes you just don't have that relationship. You don't have that rapport and so forth. And of course, that's hard for us to accept. Well, I used to always tell everybody I was a far better expert about raising children until I had them.
Yeah. I think that's everybody.
Yeah. And once you have them, all of a sudden it's much clearer, that this is not easy.
Yep. No, it's true. Jeff, I think you had mentioned the government. And can we say that God has also given the government responsibility for our families?
Yes, but in a limited way. in the sense that the state has responsibility for all of its citizens and their welfare, and families are included in that. Parents retain the primary responsibility, but in its business of taking care of the nation and its people, it may be that the state says, okay, well, we're going to provide education, and that's going to be part of it. Maybe that the government is going to say that parents need some help with this thing, so we're going to make provisions for it. Maybe even mandate it. That's not really always going to be stepping out of its bounds, but the state does overstep if and when it inserts itself too much into the family, especially in spiritual matters. If it starts saying this you must do, this you cannot do, and it's really getting into the primary responsibility of the parents to look out for the spiritual and moral training of their children. It's a common tactic of totalitarian regimes to do exactly that through control of education, through intimidation, punishments, and rewards, and frankly a good bit of brainwashing to drive a wedge between children and their parents, so that the children have their devotion not to mom and dad, but to the state or to the leader of the state. It makes it much easier then to control the next generation, and from generation to generation that way, because there is no competition for the allegiance of the children, and they'll just believe whatever they're told.
Some of this is just, we're seeing a lot of this stuff play out more. And I just think too about, just those parents that came and spoke up at school board meetings and said, no one told me that my kid had changed their name at school or their pronouns or just different things. And then there was like what parents should know when it comes to their kids and what the school should teach them, and just that type of thing too. And some real, eye-opening, honestly, conversations that were being had with some of these topics.
Well, and you have to remember in the Old Testament, we're told that people are inclined to start calling what is good bad and what's bad good. And when you begin to see that blow in full proportion, the argument that a lot of those schools were using in that circumstance was, well, it's not good, it's not healthy for the child to be living aware that they feel they're the wrong gender. And if the parents are going to fight us on that, then we have to look out for what's good for the child. In other words, they create a whole new moral framework to justify what they're doing when they have no ground to stand on in the very beginning. But that has to do with a parental flaw of lack of vigilance. You really do have to stay engaged, and you have to be aware of what's being done. But, there's a number of things. Do you remember a few years ago the debate that was going on about what's called free-range parenting, where the children were allowed to pretty much go unsupervised and
Yeah.
and that raised some very interesting questions about to what degree do you say yes and no. For example, one of the things we went through having 5 daughters, at some point you raised this question of when can I leave them home? When's the oldest one old enough to watch the younger ones? And then, of course, if you want to get into a lively discussion with people, let them talk about it. We're facing this now. I've got a wonderful daughter living in Iowa, and my grandson at 14 can drive in Iowa. At 14. It's funny because I told it to one of the other kids. Their kid was 14. They go, I'm not sure I'm going to let my kid drive at 24. But it has to do with different situations, different techniques.
Yeah, Bob, when you mentioned the free-range parenting, it did remind me, too, of parents that I had heard about in the news and, that had their child and that they were going to just let their child basically choose their gender identity. And they weren't going to tell their child if they were a boy or girl or just, real strange things where, I look at that as a Christian parent and I think, oh, my goodness, somebody needs to stop that. That is really one of my first thoughts with something like that. And so when we have these thoughts as Christians too, like when, man, that clearly doesn't seem right, how should we respond with some of that?
Well, I'm going to let Jeff answer that. Because those are hard ones.
Or do we just say to each their own? I mean, that doesn't necessarily sit right as a Christian, but I mean, what can we really do in situations like that?
I guess a lot of it comes to defining and being comfortable with where are the lines drawn in terms of what I should do or can do, and so forth. If parents say we're going to leave it up to our child whether or not to eat food, we're going to leave it up to our child whether or not to go to school, we would pretty much all be in favor of saying, the government needs to step in here, because that's neglect or that's abuse. And that's, that's a proper role of government to protect the children in those ways. But then the example that you were giving of, well, we're going to let our child choose the gender. We as informed Christians who understand these things are thinking that's neglect or perhaps even going all the way to abuse, because that is not what's best for that child. As an absolute thing, we can say that. So we would want to be able to say, well, the neighbors are doing that with their kids, so I'm gonna maybe I'm going to talk to them and just try to help them see what's going on, or maybe I'm going to if I don't feel I can do anything like that, maybe I'll see if I can talk to the kid and be helpful in that way. But maybe I'm going to go to the government and say, there's abuse going on here. There's neglect going on here. But we, of course, in this day and age, that's not likely to be well heard. But I'll just say, it is difficult. What responsibility do we have to step in or to act? Yeah, Bob, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Over the years, people have challenged me on stuff I've said or written, and I've grown to kind of divide it into two ranks. I remember early on in the time I came to CLR, at the end of a worship service, and I had mentioned about abortion, and this lady came out of church, and she was very angry with me that I would even suggest that there was anything wrong with abortion. And I had the wherewithal at the moment to say, well, ma'am, your problem isn't with me, it's with God. And, there are people who feel, well, I really like God, except I don't like him about that point or another point. But sometimes you got to get yourself out of the middle and just make it between them and God. When you get into some of these situations, I think, I've often wondered, and I look back over the years, that if I've made mistakes in this regard, and that is, we're always assigned to glorify God in all things. And so really the conversation should be with the parents about, do we agree on this fundamental truth that we are to glorify God in all things? 1 Corinthians 10:31, Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 43, 6 or 7, that we were created for the purpose of glorifying God. So how do we glorify God? Well, you do his will. And what is his will? To love God and to love others. And how do we do that? We get kind of defined and everything like that. Is what you're doing defensible before God? You don't even have to, and I've told it, when I've had conversations, you don't even have to answer me on it. But that ultimately is the question you got to wrestle with. Is it defensible? And of course, a lot of times, it drives people from the church because they finally conclude that I really don't believe in your religion. And so they will follow their itching ears to find the religion that they want. But I'm not comfortable correcting little Johnny, who now thinks he's a Julie. But I'm much more comfortable talking to Johnny's parents and just saying, you have to wrestle with this. I've encountered parents within our circles who are convinced that their son now thinks he's a girl and maybe we should let him travel that path. Well, okay, you can think that. You might even feel that. And Johnny might feel that way. But ultimately, you don't answer to Johnny. You don't even answer to me, but you do answer to God. So where does God come down? And I think one of the mistakes we make is that we oftentimes make any type of correction or any type of reminding of people of a battle between us and them. Mm-hmm. And it isn't me. There are all sorts of things that my evil inclination wants to permit that God's word doesn't.
I gave kind of a big example there, but what are maybe some of the other areas where we see tension or conflict today when it comes to family business?
Say particularly in education, public education primarily, but also in some private institutions. There's this idea that the educators know what's best, period. Parents, either go along with whatever it is, recognizing how much smarter we are than they are because we have the PhDs, or the parents just get shut out and pushed to the side as much as possible. And so there is that conflict. In the school board meeting, that's a place where we see that tension coming out, often far too late, because things often have to get really serious before parents wake up and say, wait a second, you're not doing that with my kids and in our community. But generally, there's just this sense of parental authority being slowly and consistently eroded.
And oftentimes surrendered.
Yeah.
Where they almost welcome the fact that somebody else is going to do the training and educating and indoctrinating, which is always why I've had such a personal problem with confirmation class. So often you can't get the parents engaged in the process. It's like, well, it's confirmation time, so we're going to send them to there, and then they're upset because they're not doing their memory work, and you raise it as an issue. Well, mom and dad don't work with them on it and stuff like that. Well, then they feel, well, I didn't need memory work. And I mean, you get into all these little crazy battles. So even in the church, parents aren't engaged. They surrender sometimes responsibilities. So they don't know what's going on at school. I've always so admired my one daughter had chosen, she's college graduate, degreed, that kind of stuff, but she chose to stay home. And she chose to be involved and to coach. And, on staff here, I've got a staff member who's a coach, and, she leaves early, now to coach. And I think that I very highly admire that, because you're engaged, it's being taught, and because I've seen coaches. My one daughter, who's doing a lot of this, when she was in high school, her coach was anything but a godly example of coaching. I mean, screaming and yelling and all that kind of stuff. And this way, she plays an active role of setting the right example. And I admire that, because she didn't learn that from me, and she learned better than what I taught her.
Yeah. There was a time when it was recognized that parents had authority over and responsibility for practically any unmarried son or daughter, into the late 20s, sometimes even into the 30s. Today, it's a struggle for parents to have their authority recognized over the kids they send to college. Increasingly down into, they're told that their high school students can make all their own decisions for birth control, sexual activity, sexual identity, gender identity, all these kinds of things without any parental authority involved or even influence. They're not even supposed to be informed of some things like this. And, that authority just keeps getting eroded. And it's not just, from kind of those semi-official channels, but it's especially today, people on social media trying to get between parents and their children. Sometimes it's their peers telling them, oh, your parents can't tell you that. Your parents have no business saying that's wrong or whatever. Sometimes it's more nefarious people or people with ill purposes who are trying to say, oh, no. You shouldn't listen to your parents. You're your own person. You should be making your own decision. And they're telling this to people who are like 12 years old.
As Christians too, I mean, I think we're all kind of in agreement here that we hear some of that, and it's concerning. Why is that? Why do we feel that way as Christians when we hear these things?
We work with a lot of presumptions. I remember the first time I heard about furries, about girls who thought they were cats and stuff like that.
Boys think it too.
Yeah, boys too. Yeah. And but the first time I heard it, it was like, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, and it's affirmed
in
several areas. So
but a lot of times it hits you by, because your presumption is that there's certain fundamentals that people recognize and it gets blown out of water. So part of that was disengagement. I wasn't engaged enough to know that that was going on. Now, one of the things we've been talking a lot about having parental control wrestled away and everything. I do think that parents too have to recognize, what does it mean to be a parent? I do think, remember I told you I thought I was more an expert on this until I had children. And now that my children are growing up and moved out, I'm beginning to feel like an expert again. And part of the thing is expert by virtue of mistakes. I think parenting, if I could do it all over again, I would be far more engaged. When the kids are school aged, I should have been volunteering more at the school and helping out. Volunteering at the school for me was, we've been assigned this month to be cleaning the school. That was forcible volunteering at school. I mean, I wish I was more involved. When I was growing up, my dad, I was the oldest of 4 boys. My father became a pioneer leader. He was involved. We'd go on campouts. My dad was there. We'd be at school or pioneer activities. My dad was there. I think in hindsight, parents have to be engaged. And I think a lot of these unwinding of Christian values and so forth occur because we worked with presumptions that are no longer valid.
Mm-hmm. A verse from Galatians. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who belong to the household of faith. That just reinforces for us that when we see these things happening in society, if not to our own children or our own neighbors, we care because we want what's best. This is love for our neighbor, but we also want to do what is good for our neighbor. So that really motivates Christians to be concerned and where possible to do something to help, whether it's on an individual basis, this is what's going on with my neighbor's children, or whether it's more of a political and cultural thing where, this is how I'm going to vote, or this is how I'm going to speak in order to try to influence things. From a strictly secular perspective, the children that are being affected by these things are the future of citizens of our nation. So we don't want them messed up because we don't want a messed up country. But within the church, we recognize that love for our neighbor means that we have a responsibility to look out for other people's well-being, for their growth, for their education, all those kinds of things. And again, we're called to look out for the weak and the vulnerable in our society. And that pretty much describes children to a T.
Any final thoughts on this subject?
Well, I would just say that everything about our culture today is designed to create heaven on earth. I mean, it really is. And so a lot of us in our parenting have really tried to help the children get on a track for the best possible job and to earn the best possible money and to have the best kind of home and all those kinds of things. And I wonder that in starting it over, if we were to have focused on, we have an eternal home in heaven, your job one is to glorify God in all things. And then you start communicating that at home. I've had members who were like these ideal parents, where their children come home and they grumble about, we just got this class today and they're talking about gender neutrality and stuff like that. In other words, where they become conscious of that and how you create that consciousness in your children. That's actually done not at school, but at home. So you begin there.
Yeah. As believers, what should we be doing? Obviously, first and foremost, look out for your own children. But, you see these things around you, you pray. It's pretty much your number one thing. Take it to the Lord. And do what you can to influence things. But whether it's speaking up, it's acting, it's posting, attending meetings, supporting the right causes against the wrong causes or whatever. But the thing that I think a lot of us really forget, and because it's actually a little bit more uncomfortable, is offering parents encouragement, offering them comfort and strength and help and guidance. Just like, I know what you're going through. I'm going to help you with that. How can I support you more in what you're doing here? We're afraid to help because we're afraid we're stepping into something that we shouldn't be stepping into. But, as long as we're not going in and say, I'm going to tell you what to do with your kids, we're doing okay. Have that compassion, have that willingness to help them. And particularly if you're older, if you've gone through some of these things, be there as that resource. And so that when parents are thinking, I don't know, maybe we should just give in to what the schools are doing, this, you can be the one who supports them. No, you don't have to do that. And here's the better way.
Well, thank you both for your discussion today on this topic. And we thank all of our listeners, too, for joining us. And if you have any questions on this episode or any others, you can reach us at lifechallenges.us. And we look forward to having you back next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Please consider subscribing to this podcast, giving us a review wherever you access it, and sharing it with friends. We're here to help, so if you have questions on today's topic or other life issues, you can submit them, as well as comments or suggestions for future episodes at lifechallenges.us or email us at podcast@christianliferesources.com. You can find past episodes and other valuable information at lifechallenges.us, so please check it out. For more about our parent organization, please visit christianliferesources.com. May God give you wisdom, love, strength, and peace in Christ for every life challenge.